What does this plus or minus button do on our cameras? Well, today we're going to find out. Welcome to the Visual Center. I'm Trent, and in today's video we'll be discussing exposure compensation, what it is, how it works, and how we can use it. Now, have you ever seen this symbol on your camera or heard someone mention exposure compensation? Now, I can remember the first few times I heard someone talking about it. Now, sadly, I didn't ask, and it took me a while to learn what it was. So this video should help you avoid that situation. Alright, so what is it? Exposure compensation is a control on our camera that compensates or adjusts the recommended exposure given by our cameras. For example, let's say we were shooting in a very bright scene. Our cameras could have a difficult time capturing a correct exposure for that scene because it's so bright. Now, something like a sunny day at a beach or up in some snowy mountains, both these scenarios could be difficult for a camera to capture. Often these types of scenes are darkened down or underexposed by our cameras. Now, while shooting this scene, we could use exposure compensation to compensate for the incorrect exposure our camera auto-selected or metered. Now, the opposite is also true. We could use exposure compensation to compensate for a scene which is darker. Our cameras may produce or meter the dark scene as much too bright for how it really looks in person. Now, let me demonstrate what I mean. For this demonstration, I'm actually going to photograph this analog camera. Now, I've set this camera on a white backdrop. I'm in program mode, and this is the exposure my camera is giving me. Now, you can see here in this first shot that I think the background is way too dark. It's not white, and the camera's too dark. Because the scene's so bright, my camera's overcompensating. Now, I'm going to go to +1 exposure compensation, and that should brighten my scene. And you can see here, it is brightening. So, I'm going to photograph now at +1 exposure compensation, and my next photograph is much better. The whites actually look white, and the product itself, or the item itself, looks correctly exposed. Now, for this next set of images, I'm going to put the object on a black backdrop. Now, this is a black backdrop. Now, it's too bright, mainly because I'm at +1 exposure compensation still. So I'm going to bring that back down to 0 and capture my first shot. Now, because it's a black background, my camera is compensating for that dark of a background. And you can see the blacks aren't that black, and even the silver parts of the camera are a little too bright. So I need to compensate. So I'm going to use my exposure compensation and go to -1. So I'm going to be one stop darker. You can see as I capture that next image is much better, and the silver looks correct. Now, this is on manual mode, so I'm just going to center my light meter, and that's what I get. So I'm going to use exposure compensation to do +1. Now, you see my image preview is not adjusting, or it's not brightening. So my light meter just compensated. It went down to -1 after I went to +1 exposure compensation. And now I'm realigning my light meter, and I take that next shot. Now you see that's a better exposure. The next image is the same thing, on black with manual mode, but it's still too bright. So I need to use my exposure compensation to adjust that exposure. You can see my light meter on the right hand side of the screen. I'm going to go to -1, and now the light meter says +1. So I need to compensate my exposure because I'm in manual mode. I need to adjust my exposure. And I take that last image, and you can see the blacks look black, and the rest of the image is correctly exposed. Alright, hopefully that demonstration showed you how exposure compensation works. Now, depending on which exposure mode we're using, exposure compensation will adjust different exposure settings on our cameras. If we're using a program mode, our cameras will adjust a combination of shutter speed and aperture to achieve a compensated exposure. If we're using aperture mode, A or AV mode, the camera will adjust the shutter speed. If we're using shutter priority, S or TV mode, the camera will adjust the size of the aperture. Now, when using manual mode, our cameras will adjust the readout of the light meter. If we adjust the exposure compensation while in manual, let's say +1 stop, the indicator on our light meter in our camera will move down 1 stop. As just demonstrated, I'm using manual mode, and I want to go to +1 exposure compensation. And you see my light meter going up to +1. Now, as I release the exposure compensation button, it drops back down to -1. So now I can adjust my exposure to realign my light meter. No exposure settings are adjusted while in manual mode and using exposure compensation. The light meter just compensates the readout for us to utilize. We can now choose to adjust the exposure and realign the light meter to the center indicator, which will produce a one-stop brighter image. Now let's take a look at how we would adjust the exposure compensation on a few different cameras. All right, here on this first, this is the Canon body, and there's a rear command dial here that's going to allow you to adjust your exposure compensation. On a Fuji body, there's going to be a dedicated dial here at the top where you can go plus or minus 3 stops of exposure compensation. For a Nikon, you're going to use this exposure compensation button in conjunction with a command dial to compensate your exposure. And just like the Fuji, on the Sony body, there's going to be a dedicated dial here at the top for exposure compensation. Now here's a demonstration of me using a Canon DSLR and adjusting the exposure via exposure compensation. I'm using this rear command dial, and you can see in the light meter there, I'm going +1 stop. And you see the shutter speed's changing because I'm on aperture priority. And there again, I'm going to -1 stop. And with this Canon, I can go plus or minus 5 full stops. I can go -5 or +5. And again, this is just a great way to compensate for difficult lighting scenarios using exposure compensation. Now for this next demonstration, I'm going to be using a Nikon DSLR. And you can see here I'm on shutter priority, so my aperture is not changing, but as I change my shutter speed, my aperture will auto-select. Now I'm going to press this exposure compensation button and use the command dial to go -1 or +1. And that's going to change my exposure. So the first spot, I'm going to go to -1. You can see my aperture's changed. Now I'm going to go to +1, and you see my aperture's changed again. Depending on which camera you're using, exposure compensation will most likely move in third stop increments and can move as much as between 3 to 5 full stops. All right, hopefully that last demo helped you determine how to adjust exposure compensation on your camera. Now I'm curious, do you have any experience where exposure compensation would have saved an image or did save an image? Or do you have any questions regarding exposure compensation? Let us know in the comments below. We would honestly love to hear from you. Also, if you have any requests for future videos, be sure to also let us know below. As always, be sure to subscribe, like, and click the bell icon for future video notifications. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Did you notice the twitch in my eye? Ugh.